This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Well, welcome to our new room and to our speaker, who is this a hat trick when there are three? Is that right?
This is only two. This is not the second.
No, it's the third, counting the last one at the end of last season. So we've had three kind of NGO papers. So it's very, very good. It's a kind of solid core of knowledge. Don Harrison is going to be speaking to us about Oxfam's education department during the development decade. It sounds really...
It's a very hot title. I do like to work informally, so if you wouldn't mind just going round maybe a first name, a research interest or a voluntary sector interest, just very briefly before I tell you where I'm coming from.
Okay.
Just a word.
I'm Mita Zimic, and I'm a sort of jobbing social policy researcher and interested in volunteering, basically.
That's enough, yeah.
I'm Bill Rushbrook, just interested in anything, really.
That's why you're here. Fine, yeah.
I'm Colin Rochester, I'm been involved in so many different things in voluntary action, I couldn't possibly list them. So. But including having had some contact with the Oxfam education programme.
Well, we'd like to hear about that later on, probably.
Lester Hillman, visiting professor, academic advisor, examiner, taken interest in heritage issues and urban design, that sort of thing.
Great.
I'm actually rather closely related to Leicester. I'm working on voluntary conservation movements in the post-war period, historic buildings conservation. Well, my name is Michael. Surely everybody knows who I am.
I'm Carrie. I'm working on a British voluntary organisation in the Spanish Civil War.
My name is Megan, and I'm looking at early 19th century
Charity.
Yeah, charity
In Britain.
in London.
Yeah.
And I'm Hilary Bernard, I'm an organisational consultant.
Oh.
I'm an organisational consultant.
Great.
Working with lots of organisations in the sector.
Great. Well, you've had my title. If you'd like to just pass around my glossy handout, which will explain everything I'm going to speak about this evening. What I'm going to use, no PowerPoints. I did say last time I'm an old-fashioned teacher. I like a nice piece of paper. Also, you're able to scribble all over it. So where I've provided a table of events, there may well be people in the room who can immediately add their favourite NGO or favourite publication or whatever. So that lays out the structure of what I'm going to do. I'm going to use my table to talk about how I see the important events and developments during my specific period tonight, 1960s, 1970s. Cast your minds back, the older people in the room. When I come down to directions, I'm going to give more of my own analysis, so that's perhaps less historical factual, but it's the way I see that things may have been moving. And then obviously there's some references at the bottom. So by way of introduction of myself, I dug out my first and my last NGO publications, especially for you this evening. So I'd like to start with this wonderful journal called Teaching London Kids, 1982. Short-lived, possibly radical, full of political education and many other such things. And then I found I'm writing about renaming the third world right at the start of my own NGO education career, when I was already grating against the name or the concept of trying to get teachers to teach about the third world as something rather rigid and set in stone. So I wrote here, there are two things we can begin to teach about the third world more realistically. One is to make better links in our teaching methods so that the near and the far are better related, and that actually became the essence of development education afterward, of relating development at home to development in faraway places. And the other is to allow people of the third world as far as possible to speak for themselves through our teaching materials. Unfortunately, they captioned my article with a very classic kind of rural pick of women hoeing the ground in Africa, but the concept behind the argument was that you wouldn't just be using surface ads, charity ads, but working with teachers and children in schools, you'd be trying to develop a much more subtle and complex and nuanced message about the complexities of what is, after all, the rest of the world beyond our continent, I suppose. So that I find right at the end of my career, having moved from Oxfam to Save the Children and worked for many years on children's rights. When I left finally the NGO field, I then published this sort of retrospective book, Regardless of Frontiers, Children's Rights and Global Learning, where there's actually a thread from trying to enable people to speak for themselves to a lot of the work we're trying to do in Save the Children to raise children's voices and to get school children here exchanging directly and learning with and from children in other countries. So it wasn't going through the media departments of charities or the press, but trying to work on child-to-child right to expression. And I see that in my own career as a logical continuation from my first manifesto. I'll just read a bit here. This is from 2008, actually. Many development NGOs produce hugely negative images of children intended for classroom use, either indirectly through fundraising activity or directly in their early resources produced for schools. During the 1990s, there was a reaction against such overly negative portrayal of children's lives. This is due partly to the global acceptance of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the 1989 document, and growing understanding and acceptance that children's privacy and dignity should be respected. In other words, not just, as we said at the last seminar, the returning trend of some NGOs to use hugely negative imagery of starving and dying children, but trying to add at least the dignity, the mother, the background, the more humane photography. That in brief is just to summarise where I think I've been as an activist. Since 2005 and leaving Save the Children, I completed a PhD and I've become a kind of jobbing academic. When it says at the top University of Bristol, I've just finished my honorary fellowship there. So I'm a jobbing freelancer again. If you wish to reach me at all, you'd use my personal email at the bottom of the page. I've said goodbye to Bristol and retired into Somerset to watch the sheep. So, let me turn to my handout. And actually, do please, if I say something outrageously controversial, just jump in. Because I do, having the Irish background, I do tend to witter on a bit, so you could cut. What I'd like to do with you is to take the table from right to left. So I'm going to start talking about the third world and bring the focus then into Oxfam and just say a few words about some of the things I've put in here, a lot of which might actually be gobbledygook these days. And interestingly, in trying to make the table, particularly down the UK NGO column, incredibly long names and acronyms, names of bodies that take up an awful lot of space, which may never be forgotten. So where I've put third world at the top right in a half a phrase, the NGO side just seems to me enormously complex. But on the right-hand column, very cheekily in capitals with a question mark, I see from the mid-20th century a perception that there were, in a way, three worlds. And those of us in the so-called first world working for NGOs were trying to boost learning about the so-called third world. The terminology emerged probably from France and probably post-Second World War, but you could have colonized world, you could have a number of names for the poor South. But then that, of course, leaves the second world, which was, yes, the so-called communist bloc at this time, seen as in conflict or competition, in aid or in controlling the third world. In the geopolitics, there was a perception at that time the world was divided into three blocks. Take it or leave it. Why I've put right at the bottom right, first world, because we may now have the victory of Pax Americana or capitalism or multinationals. We certainly, in my own field, have much more access to the internet for exchange learning, for learning about real world. But it's slightly ironic to me that I used to campaign for one world, and we meant solidarity and sharing and lots of ideological things. If we now have one world of global travel and interchange, it's probably not quite what people in the NGOs were campaigning for at the time. But the question marks are there because those are simply terminologies. I don't know if people here use the third one. I've got a feeling it's gone out of fashion. Developing world came in, north-south came in. The term third world, which is very much where my career was at, has sort of gone back. If you go down the right-hand column, how we've learnt about particularly the third world in the UK is all sorts of complex histories. If you were here for Andrew Jones at the last seminar, where you were given the Disaster Emergencies Committee leaflet, and you could track your own perceptions of the third world as people do generationally. Perhaps you were there for the Congo, 1960, Biafra, 68, 69, Kampuchea, 1980, Ethiopia, 1984. And you've got this very clearly laid out in the DEC leaflet. Our perceptions through the press and through fundraising appeals of a world particularly of very serious disasters, right up to the tsunami which Andrew mentioned. But that, of course, is not the only story. So in my table, perhaps fairly random, the second row I wanted to highlight for us at the time, or actually I was very, very young, but a lot of people at the time found Tanzania a really good role model. And Nyereri's two 1967 documents, the Arusha Declaration on self-independence, self-reliance, not depending on Western aid, and at the same time the specific policy document called Education for Self-Reliance, had a lot of effect on NGO educators in a way that I think later on perhaps Nicaragua became a sort of ideal state, and then there were others. But in the period I'm trying to get my mind back into, Tanzania was seen as quite a positive example of African development or self-development. So I put that in my table. The Pearson report, the Pearson report of 1969, Partners in Development, was produced by the World Bank and had a huge influence, according to what I can learn, in the setting up of the World Development Movement, which comes later in my story. It was a very influential report globally, and it used this terminology like partners in development, not just handing out aid, that everyone was working in partnership. The next event is almost unknown now, but certainly Oxfam's head of education was helping to run probably the first ever European Development Education Conference in Sweden in 1970. And I put that in because I like the title, the school, or the European school, open to the third world, open for learning. And I suppose a book that influenced my own practice a lot, Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which came out when I was training to teach, and is very influential in its methodology to quote, learning with the people about the people's world, not handing down learning, but learning as a shared activity. And in between those examples that I just put in the chart, of course, the UN named the 1960s the first world development decade. And I think they felt that was so important that the 1970s were then carried on as the second development decade. And that's my particular period this evening, like 1960 to 1980. No questions? Nobody want to wildly contradict one of my analysis? I won't linger too long on what I've called the UK state. From my own interest, the Ministry of Education, which I haven't plotted in this column because it changed names so often, generally was called the Department of Education and Science during my period, The Ministry of Education plays a relatively lightweight role in the growth of learning about third world issues for a lot of reasons. So for my column, I've simply put the Butler Act in 1944. It's very important in our history of education. And towards the bottom, the Education Reform Act in 1988, which brought in the national curriculum. It's important to understand that because of the free way we used to work with schools at regional, at local authority level before the national curriculum. That's why I've plotted that in as quite significant in the educational field. As far as Ministry of Education's support for this kind of global learning, the only thing I really think was strategic was a UNESCO document on education for international understanding in 1974, which I haven't put in the table, but is only significant because the Ministry of Education actually did send it to every school in England. But the covering note that went to schools said something like, I know you won't have much money to carry out this, but we're obliged by UNESCO to send.
What month was that?
What month?
Well,
It's definitely 74.
There are two general elections, so
Yeah.
there's Mrs. Thatcher who is responsible.
No, it's Edward Heath. Heath to Wilson.
Yeah, but in terms of the Secretary of State,
It was
Mrs. Thatcher.
no. Yes, I see your point. It was after the Labour victory, I'm pretty sure, and it was the incoming Ted Short, possibly the incoming Labour Minister of Education. You might know of him. I think it was in the summer.
Deeply unmemorable, I think.
The election was. That's why I've left the DES out of my story.
Well, there's a little period from 1970 to 73 where, Thatcher is there and the DES is the registrar for charities which are educational. No, I don't know whether they use that or whether Thatcher didn't pay any attention, because I've encountered one or two charities which were registered, which have got very odd terms, but I don't think may not have gone into development education at all.
I don't. Not that I was.
Sorry, it's an error.
No, that's. From your question, I'm pretty sure it was the incoming Labour government. In fact, I was doing research for this in the PhD, and there was a real toss around between the DES and the ODM about who would go to Paris to the Conference on Education for International Understanding. Because it was like tossing around responsibility. And if I'm right, ODM actually took over responsibility for UNESCO at one stage. It wasn't in the hands of DES. I didn't plot these because this history is actually so wide. All I've tried to do is find some threads through it. If people in the room can enlighten, please do. The really significant thing, certainly from Oxfam's point of view, is the ODM. And I've plotted a few things. The antecedents are like Colonial Development Acts in the 50s, Department of Technical Assistance in the Colonial Office. The word development was there. I've also looked at Fabian papers at LSE, where it's really interesting, just before the 64 election, saying we need an overseas development ministry in this country. At the same time, they said we need a home development ministry. And when Wilson came to power and put Barbara Castle into the first ODM, the idea of home development, I think, was just dropped. It was the Home Office. The concept of home development was, I think, quietly shelved. But we did get an ODM, 1964, which in my chart is actually downgraded by the incoming Heath government in 70 to an ODA, back into the Foreign Office, loss of cabinet status, to re-emerge in 74 with the return of the Wilson government, as once again as a separate ministry with a cabinet minister.
Reg Prentice.
And yes, Reg Prentice and Judith Hart between them, with Reg Prentice coming and going. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Prentice is the only person who held both Education Ministry and Development Ministry.
I think that's correct.
I think that is correct. Judith Hart in 78 is pushing for a government report on development education, which, when I was reading it, suggested there would be a large expansion of government funds. which were lost in the 79 election, when the ODM went back to being the ODA, and that promise of funding was dropped. You could say it doesn't matter because the EU money came in, NGO money came in, but there's a history there. Down to right at the bottom, DFID from 97. And the thing I've put at the right, very bottom, enabling effective support, was another move from government to support development education, putting a lot more money towards the NGOs or development education centres or whatever. So I see that as a flux, partly determined by party politics, but a flux in the development ministry and its relationship with the education ministry, which is behind my PhD research. But I'm not sure there's been very much research and written up. I might do with some more exposure by someone. Time will run out, so let me run on. In the NGO column, groups that I think are significant, I put CEWC in 1939, Council for Education for World Citizenship, who I worked for a while, and have been absorbed into the Citizenship Foundation recently. It's gone off the map. But when the League of Nations Union, which was perhaps the big global learning movement in the 1930s, when that split at the start of the Second World War between, I think, pacifists and less pacifists, CEWC emerged, and terminology of global citizenship seemed to arrive from that date. And they very much saw themselves as the networking body. Although also I would pay some attention to the United Nations Association, which I didn't plot, but if you look at my documents at the bottom, LSE's got a very rich UNA archive. If you want to really know what movements were going on, you can read their magazines, journals. Right through my history, United Nations in this country has a role to play, which again, I know some historians at Winchester working on it, I think, but another field which perhaps could be looked into. Andrew last seminar mentioned FFHC, Freedom from Hunger, which was a way of agencies sharing aid programs, but from my interest, they set up an education committee which started to monitor exam syllabuses for third world questions, started to bring the NGOs to begin to work together. And when they disbanded in 65, they were taken over, possibly under Barbara Castle's prompting, as a stronger voluntary committee which ran for many decades, VOCAD. And when I come on to Oxfam, a lot of the history I've seen in Oxfam archives is, should one invest in VOCAD and go outside one's own NGO for a greater partnership support? Or did that risk just diluting your effect and you were stronger actually being Oxfam or Christian Aid? There seems to be an ongoing debate about sort of basically competition versus collaboration within the NGO sector. Andrew mentioned the Hazelmere Declaration in 68, a radical statement on aid. I've only put that in because I think it was very directly influenced by Nyereri's Arusha Declaration, and would support my general belief that third world voices were listened to. Everything wasn't just coming from within the UK. Anti-poverty, I'll say a bit more actually under Oxfam. And I could have put in the 1960s box so many other separate NGOs. I could have put VSO, I could have put Amnesty International emerging in our field, particularly in the 1960s. I've chosen to put Third World First, which in a way grows out of Oxfam, but is not controlled by Oxfam, in 69. And by 73 I set up what became quite a popular journal in this field, it's still on sale, The New Internationalist. So from my point of view, in the NGO sector, there's a lot going on in the late 60s. There seem to be new bodies emerging. It's a time of change. UNESCO's report in 74 is very important in the education field, Changing World in the Classroom. as was the World Studies Trust, another separate body which was very active in the field in the 70s, and a publication called Learning for Change in World Society. All of these things were quite influential on what Oxfam and Christian Aid and Save the Children practitioners were doing. Right at the bottom, development education centres have emerged. They set up a national association which becomes the Development Education Association. It's just renamed itself, but it's still in existence. Although the man who ran it for very many years is now at the Institute, running the Development Education Research Centre, Institute of Education, Doug Bourne. So I'd like to go on to Oxfam to fill in the core of my story from things that you may not know. In 1942, a number of committees for famine relief were set up in the UK during the war. The Oxford one is the one that has lasted. So the group of religious and philanthropic people who met at St Mary the Virgin Church late in 1942 wouldn't have realised that they were setting up a multi-billion-dollar development NGO at the time, because the other committees disbanded. Oxfam stayed on after the war. By the mid-60s, it shortened its name. I was talking about acronyms. It's simply become Oxfam, a household name, high street shops, and so on. And actually from 1959 decides there's so many requests coming in from schools for information that they appoint the first full-time paid schools officer. And then during the 60s that grows into an instituted education department. There's also a youth department, but I'm saying less about them this evening. You get a growth of a belief from Oxfam management that it is worth spending some time and money on education within the UK. Although constituted as a body to do international or overseas development aid and relief work, there's a growing belief that something should be put into education. I'll skip over my nucleus because that's going to come up below. But after some changes of direction, you get an even larger department in the 1970s, which very significantly does not have a fundraising brief and is therefore freed to do educational work for its own sake. And from that emerges development education centres around the UK, which is where I spent quite a number of years working. In 1980, Oxfam has commissioned an HM Inspector of Schools to report on the Education Department, a little known document called the Wigram Report, deep in the Oxfam archive, which basically said you need to move further out into the teaching profession. You need to work with advisors, you need to work teachers' workshops, you need to be much more professionally instituted if you're really going to have an impact. And part of my story is a dilemma between the teaching profession and the NGO sector. The last thing in the box is the most influence Oxfam's probably had on our education is a 1997 document called Curriculum for Global Citizenship. The terminology has changed. But so has the field of operation, because where my generation worked a lot at regional level to try and institute change from the classroom up. With the national curriculum from 88 on, it has been more effective to produce curriculum documents like the Oxfam one, saying, well, that's your national curriculum, we think you're missing global ethics or whatever. So they produced a counter statement which had a lot of impact in the late 90s. So go on to the essence of the story. Does anybody want to? I feel I'm talking about my own world of interest.
Did that inspectorate report assess impact?
To some extent, in that they were given a list of people to go and talk to, and you're talking about the way analysis is done. I would say it was loaded in that the inspector was sent to meet successful projects, as it were. But he did quite a wide amount of field work in order to then report to Oxfam management. I think that's significant because I don't think they've done that before. People have just said, let's do education work. And that was a genuine move to pay someone to actually give an analysis of how effective the work was by talking to the profession. So answer your question. I do feel all this stuff I just find really interesting, and I think there should be more research on it. Sometimes I feel I'm a bit on my own. My love of Oxfam education.
Can I ask a really dumb question?
Please do.
So, like, what's their motive for getting involved in the education system? Because if I'm understanding you correctly, Oxfam was trying to sway educational policies so that students growing up through the UK learned about the third world and theoretically
in a positive
what
way.
Oxfam was doing.
Yeah.
Which I don't think happens in America on any level, or at least not that I'm aware of. So, I mean, the entire topic's a bit foreign to me in the sense of I can't see this happening in America.
Well, and many people would have said it wasn't the NGO's role to do this.
Right.
Which is why I'm talking about the teaching profession.
So what was their motive? Like, were they just trying to create a society in which these kids would grow up and then give money to Oxfam?
Well, that's partly why I read those original quotes, because those of us working in the field thought we were trying to do something more positive than that. Look at my 3 Ps then, under directions. The box says the future of Oxfam 1969, up in the middle of the box, because in 1969 there was a huge rift. Now, I said at the last seminar, the hardest thing in NGO research is to find out what's actually going on inside NGOs. And very often the rifts never become public. But this one hit the press. Oxfam split from top to bottom. And there was a real division between the deputy director, who comes under my political education sentence, Nicholas Stacey, Bishop of Woolwich, who then went to Oxfam for a brief period. Nicholas Stacey submitted a paper saying our education work is not achieving anything. It needs to be much more politically punchy. He used this phrase, education propaganda, which is a bit strong in NGO terms, I think. Education propaganda politics work, and he sent this internal memo around initially as a confidential document, which was then shared with staff. And there were, from what I can gather, quite raging debates going on under the placid surface of Oxfam House, Summertown, Oxford. You have probably the cafeteria, I can picture divisions for about 3 months. By 1970, the director, I've changed the spelling because I believe Leslie Kirkley, well, he was always called HLK because he was in Oxfam for so long, but I think he's an LIE. Leslie Kirkley, who had been in Oxfam for 20 years, resisted his deputy's proposal and said our fundamental aim is aid work. So answering your question to some extent, Oxfam was moved back to saying we will do education work in the UK, but its primary function is, actually the phrase the educated pound was used, to educate children who might be future donors or possibly aid workers, rather than, say, influence the state curriculum so that more global learning is going on, which is what we thought we were doing in the 70s and 80s. So in the internal debate in January 70, there was a unusually straight confrontation between whether education should have more of a political intent in UK terms, particularly aimed at the aid programme. Should there be more aid, better informed aid, particularly aimed at government rather than schools per se. And the rather more safely programme which had emerged up to then in Oxfam's first 25 years, which these are my terms, but I'm calling that a split between potential for political education, which in some ways was actually farmed out to New Internationalist with Oxfam funding, but not Oxfam control. Things that were taken out of the NGO. But the education department stayed within the NGO. After the January 70 debates, the deputy resigned, the head of education resigned, a lot of youth staff resigned, because they felt there was a reactionary manager which wasn't really interested in any sort of active education at home, which is understandable in some ways, the Charity Commission, the limits of political education in the charity field, and the constituted business of giving aid overseas. Oxfam was set up for. some of us who'd wandered in from the education profession might have been in the wrong place because there were restrictions. In my story, the key man, actually they're all men, interestingly, I don't know if you need to know, there was a woman, the head of Christian Aid, and there was a woman in charge of Catholic Institute for International Relations, but my characters tonight were the men running the NGOs. Og Thomas, who I knew personally, O.G. Thomas, was head of education in the late 60s. I found him in Oxfam News in about 69 saying we're limit restricted, there's a limit to what we can do. We can give materials to teachers, but we can't really institute any great change. Thomas resigns, sets up his own NGO called Anti-Poverty, which is in the middle of my table, trying to do early development education, trying to work with LEAs and schools on a concept of development at home and abroad. Because Anti-Poverty fails to fund itself as a one-off enterprise, as a small NGO, Thomas returns to Oxfam in 1974 to head up again the education department. And this is why I think it's important that with the change of director, my compatriot from Northern Ireland takes over Oxfam in 74, Brian Walker. The change of director, a change of policy, 5% of Oxfam income is dedicated to education and awareness work without any need to raise funds. And to me that's quite important, because then the education department doesn't have to show the money it's making from schools or materials, and is therefore freer to set up programs. And from that, as it says under proactive education, semi-autonomous development education centres emerge, initially from the Oxfam education offices, North London, South London, Birmingham and Leeds, and then merges into a network of other development education centres set up by other bodies. The first one in the history was actually in Norwich. It wasn't set up by any NGO, but by a group of enlightened people in Norwich who wanted a third world awareness centre. From the DECs starting in 1970s, you get a sort of movement for development education in my history, but I might argue has been more or less taken over by environmental education, rights education, citizenship education, and even the concept development education has probably dropped back, even though DFID has been funding it to today. That's about the story.